Let's start with our word for the day. Invidious. Invidious.
What's it?
Sandy? Invidious?
Invidious?
Yes.
From invasion?
No. Incorrect.
That's actually close. Unfair or unfavorable comparison. So I'm going to talk about, I mostly build aircraft. I'm going to make some comparisons about building airplanes and tanks. So I'm not trying to make invidious comparisons.
Okay.
So if I try to summarize the difference between building an airplane and a tank, I'm going to suggest that building a tank is maybe a little bit more lenient. There's a few things that you can do with a tank that you definitely cannot do with an airplane. Certainly they both require attention to making things square, like you can't have a roll wheel riding high, you can't have a track out of whack, you can't have a turret on crooked. But if you have a blemish on the hull, you can just put some mud on it and bodge it on. With an airplane, not so much. But there's one thing about airplanes that is different than tanks, and that is airplanes generally consist of a bunch of very small, fragile subassemblies. So when you're building an airplane, you're getting a bunch of subassemblies, the cockpit, the wheel wells, any other detail that may be associated with it, and then you're enclosing that inside the airframe. So having built aircraft over the years, there's certain techniques and certain principles that you develop in order to do that. So I had that in mind when I got inspired by this. So some of you might recognize this model. This is Sandy?
There's the mic.
This is Mike Rinaldi. So this is Mike Rinaldi. This was in one of his books, and coincidental, this book being released, he came to Hornet Hobbies and put on a series of seminars. Many of you were there for that.
That's right. Is that 148?
Yes. And he brought this model, and I knew what a Pershing was, of course, but this is the first time I'd seen it look like this. And to me, it looks very different than what I typically think of as a Pershing tank. And I think it's because the fenders are missing, and the stowage on it actually changes the shape of the model. And this angle certainly kind of reminds me almost of a Russian tank as compared to an American tank. So I was taking these courses because I was interested in understanding some of the techniques that tank modelers were using, and I was with a view to trying to apply them to airplanes. But I was so fascinated by this model, I actually decided to try it myself. Of course, the first thing you have to do is some research. So one of the things that I discovered was that the Pershing was actually the forerunner of just about every modern tank that followed after it, certainly up to the M60. So the chassis, the suspension, etc., that was developed for the Pershing actually carried on into the M60, and certainly the same principles are applied into the M1 Abrams. You can see that over the life of production, it changed subtly, but it changed enough that you can recognize the differences between the various marks. And one thing about a Pershing is that it seemed as if the Americans were trying their best to learn their lessons from what they had learned so far in World War II. Of course, this tank was designed roughly 1942, 1943, I think was the sort of time frame. It was put in production sort of late 44, early 35, and then it was sent over to Europe for trials.
Towards the end of the war.
Yep, towards the end of the war.
Because they classified it as a heavy tank.
At that time, that's correct.
And it was considered it was easier to ship
Yes.
2 medium tanks
Yes.
than 1 heavy tank.
Yes, yes, and you can see that there's a whole bunch of racks and so forth to stow stuff. And these racks were actually specific. So for example, this rack here on the right side of the turret, was actually the covers that went over top of the co-driver positions if they were parking it with the hatches open or they were driving, I think, in the rain. They actually had developed a tarp that would actually do that, and then they had packaged it up and then added a rack that would actually go there. And if you look at the actual real one, you can see there's all kinds of racks and whatnot that are on the model, or on the tank, I should say. So for example, this rack here, that's for spare track. This rack here, that's for a tool that's used for jacking it up and repairing track and so on.
50 cal absorber back there as well?
Well, That's right. So there's a rack back here where the crew could actually store the 50 caliber machine gun. And you can see that it's actually a little bit like an airplane. It's actually got struts because these fenders were very thin sheet metal, and they were prone to flex and so on as the tank drove. So they actually required some strengthening.
That was the post-war one, wasn't it?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, and it's very much like rigging on an airplane. It's to brace the frame. You can also see what's known as footman stirrups all over the fenders, and those are so that you can strap stowage to the actual tank.
Or foliage.
Or foliage.
For
Yes.
example.
Yeah. So when Pershing actually got into action, you can see the crews started to use the tank as they saw fit. So for example, here you'll see where the tracks is. You can actually see the top of the track here. They've now strapped jerry cans and helmets and so on to the actual spare tracks. You can see that there's the rack at the back here. What often would happen is they would have a spare 50 caliber machine gun barrel or a warped barrel, a burnt out barrel, and they would put it in its position and then use that as a rack for stowage as well. And this one, you can see that there's by the way, these shots are all in Korea. In Korea, I should say. So the history of the tank was a certain number were built, I think about 1,300, all ended, contract was canceled, most of them went into storage, I should say. Korea started, they had to get them out of storage and get them into action because that's the heaviest tank that they had. And at that time, the Americans were being overpowered by the T-34s that the North Koreans had. So they were rushed to Korea, and once they got there, they started to rack ammunition on the side of the fenders. And you can see here, there's stowage that's strapped to the actual fender itself. There's a rack that's been custom made for the back here on the thing. You can see once again, storage draped over top of the spare 50 caliber barrel. See the jerry can sort of hanging off the fender here. So the crew, in other words, is improvising and making sure they can carry as much with them as possible when they go out on a mission. And then what actually started happening was once the T-34s were defeated, it was mostly, of course, infantry that they were facing. And interestingly enough, although it's not in this shot, those racks that you saw with the spare ammunition, I read a very good book about the Marine Corps using Pershings in Korea, and those racks were there not for the tank crew, but for infantry. So when the tank went into combat, the infantry that would support it, they would have racks of ammunition they could readily get access to. You can also see that you may have noticed before, but you can actually see the original position for the 50 caliber machine gun was on the turret, similar to a Sherman in World War II. It was actually at the back of the turret, which of course meant that if you were firing forward, you had to expose yourself. And so what happened a lot in Korea was that they added an extra mount forward of the commander's position for a machine gun. And once again, you can see there's something, there's a K ration box of some sort strapped to the front fender.
Excuse me. That's not a 90 millimeter gun, is it?
Yeah, it's just, the picture's just cut off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just, yeah.
Thought it was a.
It's not that.
So of course these pictures are obviously black and white, and as someone who's relatively new to Armour, it's tough for me to kind of associate how these things actually get weathered. And so what I find very useful is things like this. So I know how many times when I was building this model, I would fast forward to the various combat sequences and various sequences where they were driving around in the Sherman to understand how the tank actually got weathered. But I also see that they're mounting a machine gun similar to what happened in Korea as an extra machine gun, and was used in this movie for that purpose to support the infantry that they were driving into towns with. So I looked at this picture and I thought, you know what, that's the kind of a feature that I'd like to incorporate in my model. So with all this in my head, I was like, okay, so how am I going to mount the stowage on the model itself? And of course, the tricky thing about stowage is it has to look natural. We all know what that means. We've all seen things hanging from something, the back of the door. And if any of your skiers, you know what it's like to strap things to your roof of your car. So there's a very subtle way that stowage actually has to work on a model. And of course, it has to look like it's actually hanging from a strap or something like that. Now, of course, if you try to do that on a model, that's a very tricky thing to accomplish, to try and get that strap to actually take the weight of the stowage itself and look realistic. and be able to pull that off without wrecking the rest of the model, because you're trying to juggle the model and glue this little part on the little thin strap. So I had all this in mind when I started this project. So of course, the first thing I did was the hull, and this is where, once again, when you're building any kind of model, you have to make sure it's square. So even though this is, to me, a kit, I put the effort in to make sure all of the various axles are properly lined up. You can also notice these gray parts here. This was something that I added onto the model because this kit is designed with a working suspension. That's one of the reasons why I had to make sure that the suspension was properly lined up. And as a result, the shock absorbers that the kit gives you are compressed. And so when you have the suspension in neutral, there's a noticeable gap between the shock absorber and the actual mounting point to the axle. So these parts are actually from the Dragon kit. And I just added some plastic to make sure that they fit properly. And then what I started to do is I started to think about the stowage as a sub-assembly. And started to think about how I would build a model of the stowage and then mount it to the main model itself. So in this case, you can see down here, so both the sea ration box and the two jerry cans are actually pinned. I actually pinned the two jerry cans together. So I put them in such a way that it looked more casual because they're slightly offset, which means, of course, because they're on a curved surface, they're going to have a slightly different angle. And to preserve that, I actually made it an assembly. I put pins between the two jerry cans so that I could make sure that it was sitting properly, and then drove a pin into one of the jerry cans and used that to mount it to the fender. And by doing that, it's a hell of a lot easier to paint it. So now I can paint these parts separately. And as you can see, there's the pin. It just gets dropped into place and Bob's your uncle. Now, when I actually got to the actual storage itself, so in other words, the various bags and there's some blankets and so on that are actually on the model, the product that was recommended to me by a bunch of figure guys is something called Sculpt. So this is a two-part epoxy. You take equal parts, you work it together, you let it sit for 30 to 45 minutes, and then you can actually, by using generous amounts of talcum powder, you can actually roll it out to paper thin consistency.
Where did you get it from?
That I actually got at a model show in Chicago.
Because I've stores all in the States. It's really hard to find them.
Really? Yeah. You might want to check online. It's
I was thinking about the art stores like above ground art supplies and stuff like that.
possibly, I'm sure. Yes, it does. I don't know whoever set the price. It does. I mean, I don't know what. I think that was like $35 for these two. I mean, I'll never run out of it.
Well, it apparently has a shelf life.
Oh, does it? Okay.
Yeah, it'll eventually, apparently if you're gonna use it, make sure that you're not using the same scoop or touching it with your hands when you used one to the other. Like use two separate scoops and then bag it. Yeah, it'll start the reaction. So bag each one and use a separate thing to take it.
There you go.
There's a similar product called epoxy sculpt.
Yep, I actually tried that and I couldn't make it work. Now I've heard people, it's just one of those things.
I was going to say that you can get that from taxidermy
Yes.
suppliers,
Yes.
so I didn't know that they would do that too.
Yes, yes. So there's people that swear by epoxy sculpt, there's people that swear by magic sculpt.
$64 for a pound on
Pound.
Amazon.
Pound would
About
last.
in seconds.
Yeah, pound would last you a long time. I mean, what is that? That's 8 ounces.
Yeah.
So what I did was, I just built it up at the back. So these two here represent the parts as they came. So in this case, this was a Tamiya pack. You can see it's got a hole in the back. And then this was a for Linden. And so in both cases, of course, they weren't designed to sit flush to any particular surface. So I just simply built up the back of the pack with this epoxy. And then by pinning it, I always know that when I position it, it's always going to be in the same position. So all I did was build it up, slide it into place, and it just formed up perfectly against the side of the tank. You can also see it here. So I've draped it over the. So this was the rack designed for something completely different, but in most pictures, it's actually used to carry other things. So I just rolled out the Magiscope, rolled it up, draped it in place, and it's fantastic. And then with this one, I don't know if you can see in the picture, I used lead foil. So there's actually a company that does lead foil already flattened out, ready to go in various dimensions. Thank you. It's, if you go online, they've got all kinds of different sizes. It's fantastic. It's not lead foil, pardon me, it's solder, flattened solder. So they actually, it's solder, same material as solder, so it's just flattened out like this. Yeah. And this, I don't know if you can see, this is actually Tamiya masking tape. And so Tamiya masking tape, the way I used that was I would obviously just run it around and tape it up. And then you just take extra thin CA and just paint it onto it, and it'll just harden. I think there's a couple of veterans here. How many people remember Ron Lowry? Yeah. So Ron used to have a saying called "Make them strong." So when you're building an airplane, of course, often it would be sitting on a big airplane sitting on very flimsy landing gear. So what Ron used to do was he used to pin it. That's where I got a lot of the ideas around this sort of stuff. So in this case, knowing that I was going to put this machine gun barrel at the back of the tank, knowing that I had a bunch of photo etch parts that represent the clips, there's no way that I was going to risk all of that by just using CA. So all I did was just drill holes in the barrel, drill holes in the arms, slide the rod into place, snip it off, put some super glue on the top, sand it, it's done. That ain't ever going off.
Hey John, you're putting on the tarps, you leave everything on the vehicle?
Yes.
You paint it all
Yes.
on the tarp.
Yes. Thanks for asking. So to Dave's point, I think it's better to actually paint everything in position, because that way you can weather it, you can blend it in with the rest of the model. I find sometimes when people add extras on a model after the fact, they look like they're extras, they don't look like they're actually part of the model. And it also benefits because once again, the goal that I had with all of this was I didn't want to have to risk the weight of these things when I was actually assembling. So the weight of all these bags is taken by the pins that are behind it. So the straps, even though it looks like the straps are holding in place, they're purely decorative. And then what I did was, I like to have something I can actually hold while I'm painting. So I can, you can brace your hand. You guys, when you're painting fine things, a figure or something, you've got to brace your hands. So I found an appropriate sized vessel. In this case, I think it was a juice jar. Got somebody to cut off the top, and then taped it to the bottom of a circle, cardboard heavy duty circle, and all of a sudden I got a handle out of it to paint the turret. So here you can see the pins again. So this is, remember we saw that picture of with the jerry can strapped to the rack for the spare tracks. So each of the tracks has got pins, and the jerry can itself. So they actually telescope into one another, so that when it comes time to paint it, it's no problem. And once again, and especially in this case, this strap here, if I was to try to hold that in place while I ran a strap around and try to hope that was going to hold, it just wouldn't happen. It was just, I'd drop it or I'd destroy it or break it in some fashion. So in this case, because it was pinned, all I had to do was run the lead foil behind it, and it was done. And it also meant that these little details, so these little clasps, they're just photo etch. So they're not doing anything except, again, being decorative, because the weight of the part itself is actually the result of the pins behind it. And this one, so I was really perplexed by how I was going to do the ammunition rack. So once again, if you think about it, it's what they did was they just simply welded a spot welded a piece of flat steel so they could just rack the ammo cans. So if I tried to do that as a piece of photo etch, it wouldn't last more than however many times I didn't sneeze, basically. So for this, I actually had a consultation with another known aircraft guy, Duncan McIntosh. Some of you might know that name. And he came up with this ingenious idea. So what he suggested was, I'm going to use 2 cans as fence posts. I'm going to use 1 block of plastic to get the height. I'm going to use another block of plastic to get the depth. And then all I had to do was balance the very lightweight piece of brass that I folded up, 2 folds, and I'm done. Balance it in place like that, and then you guys have heard of or used a tool called the looper. So this is just a little eye. It picks up a drop of CA, and as soon as you touch it to anything, it's just capillary action. It just draws the CA right into place. So I put the 2 cans in place, balanced the piece of brass that I had folded, touched it with glue, and now I have an assembly that I can add after the fact. Which of course makes it easier for final assembly. So when it's time to actually do this rack, I just simply drop the various cans in place with white glue and no worry, no fuss. And then as I was getting towards the end, I was of course watching this as I was going, and the thing that fascinated me was the amount of dirt, mud, etc. that was building up on the top of the tank. And I don't know if you guys know about how this movie was actually made. The stars of the movie, they actually lived in the tank while they were doing the filming. So it actually represented life in a tank. And if you watch it closely, you'll pick up on these kinds of details. So that's what I was thinking of when I was actually finishing the model. So, I've carried mud and dirt, whatever, up all around where the crew would walk. Now, a couple little things I'm going to point out here. So somebody was commenting on the shoe. So the shoe is actually there because, if you recall, this is a part that I had pinned to the fender. And what's actually in real life holding it in position is this strap here that wound its way through the lifting hook on the opposite side. And there's no way that I could get the strap to actually go the full way around the lifting hook and underneath the box and have it all taut. Like I couldn't reach in. There's no way I could reach in there and pull that thing taut. So to cover up and to draw your eye away from the fact that you can't see the bottom of I put a shoe. And then this one, this bag, it was the only one that actually sat proud of the hull, or pardon me, the turret. So you could actually see the pin. So I covered that up with a towel. And then create a little bit of interest. That's either Thurston Howell, Tokyo Hilton, or Trump Hotel. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Actually, thank Sandy. So once again, I don't have a lot of experience with, and Sandy was very good enough to lend me one of his models. So
My pleasure, John.
yeah. So
Thank you very much. It's very good. Thank you.